Hello, everybody. It's Yusai Chujin here. I'm super excited to be here to present our webinar series to you. I'm preparing for Copilot. So we talked earlier about Microsoft Launch ID. So Microsoft Launch ID was formerly known, of course, as Azure Active Directory. So think of Microsoft Launch ID as a cloud-based identity and access management system that allows your users to access external resources. So what is an external resource? Think of Microsoft 365 as an external resource. Think of the Azure portal as an external resource. And the thousands of SaaS applications that users connect to. Think of all of them as an external resource. You have all types of different identities. You have human identities. These are your user accounts. You have your workload and service accounts. You have your customers that you deal with through B2B Direct Connect, through B2B guest users. You have partners that you collaborate with. And of course, you have your endpoints. So there's quite a lot of signals that Entra ID is processing on a daily basis. If you really look at all the different thousands and millions and trillions of signals that Microsoft looks at, there's a robust set of things that it's looking at on a day-to-day basis, right? Hour by hour, it's looking at everything that's coming into the environment and applying granularized policies. It gives you the capability as an administrator to really apply granular policies against each and every sign-in and against each and every logon. And shortly, we'll talk about conditional access policies and we'll talk about Entra ID protection and how that's going to help you really control that sign-in activity into your environment. Yeah, Microsoft also applies a lot of machine learning and AI and automation to each sign-in, right? It has to look at, and not necessarily look at each individual sign-in, because sometimes sign-ins, you look at an individual basis, might look normal, but it applies previous logic. It looks at your logic of where did you log in from yesterday, and now you're logging in from a completely different location. Well, it's able to connect those dots. So Microsoft really built Microsoft Entra ID to be a robust identity and access management system, right? Active Directory was more provided user authentication, right? It had some legacy protocols. Well, Microsoft built Entra ID, really built this robust system, and it allows you to connect basically everything and allows your users to kind of have that seamless experience. And we'll kind of talk about that as we kind of progress. So Microsoft Entra ID has some, very core principles, securing adaptive access. So I talked earlier about adaptive access and kind of what that means as far as adapting to each and every sign-on. So it's able to look at each individual sign-on, and based on the sign-in activity, based on where you're signing in from and what type of sign-in and whether there's a risk involved with that sign-in, whether it's a user risk or a sign-in risk, it's able to adapt to it and apply things like MFA, right? It's able to block access, as an example. It's able to force some things like secure password reset, and we'll talk about that when we get into Entra ID. Protection shortly. We'll talk about that more in detail. Provides a seamless user experience, right? It allows you to sign on against all of your applications in a kind of seamless manner. And I'll show you the SSO portal when users log in and access their different SaaS applications, and kind of gives that seamless experience again for your end user to be able to log in and have all of their apps in front of them and being able to log in seamlessly across to those apps, and creates a unified identity management system for allowing you to have a single identity to log in across. And I can't harp the importance of having that. A lot of organizations, and many organizations, have multiple identities that they're evaluating, right? You're looking at logging into an HR system, you're looking at logging into different SaaS applications. Some are more sensitive applications, some are less impactful applications, right? If users have to remember multiple different credentials, and let's say a user leaves the organization, now you have to worry about going in and actually disabling accounts across different systems. Now, having that unified identity really gives you that control, whether you're accessing a cloud application or on-premise application, and we'll talk about different scenarios for that. It really kind of allows you to have that single identity to log in across all these applications, and brings that security and having that single unified identity when you're accessing all these different applications and environments, right? So I talked about secure adaptive access. So there's a lot of user-friendly MFA options, and we'll look at that shortly. And being able to configure conditional access policy. I can't harp the importance and beauty of what conditional access policy can do in the environment. How important it is that you have the correct and proper conditional access policies to really control that sign-in each and every time, right? And you'll see shortly when I talk about Entra ID protection and I talk about user and sign-in risk, how that machine learning is applied. So I mentioned a little bit earlier about how Microsoft applies that machine learning and looks at the risk level of the user, looks at things like atypical travel as an example, sees where you logged in from previously, where are you logging in from now, are you possibly using a net new device, right? So it's adapting to each and every sign-on as it's happening in real time, and it applies policies against that sign-in. Rather than, look at having a static set of policies and say, okay, look at this sign-in individually. It really kind of, once it applies that machine learning, that's where it really intelligently is able to predict whether or not this is a good sign-in or a bad sign-in or what I should do, right? If you change IPs as an example, it will immediately note, okay, this might be something wrong, and it can immediately apply MFA against that sign-on just to make sure it's actually you that's signing in and not the bad actor, right? So that's where you'll see the power of where some of these tools kind of come in with, especially with Entra ID protection, and I'll talk about that shortly. Now I mentioned MFA, and we kind of talked about MFA, so I wanted to kind of talk about the different types of user-friendly MFA options that are available. Starting off with the Microsoft Authenticator app, which I'm sure we're all familiar with and have used either the Microsoft Authenticator or some sort of Authenticator app. And along with that, there's additional MFA options. Windows Hello for Business, amazing way to MFA onto your machines, where you use a PIN or biometrics to actually log onto your machine. The authentication is stored on your local machine, what's called a TPM chip. So it's able to securely allow you to log into your machine. There's additional options for FIDO2 keys, cert-based authentication. So Microsoft really provides a robust set of user-friendly MFA options that you can enforce and allow your users to register. And also things like SMS and voice, which are generally not recommended. And a fun fact is many cyber insurance companies recommend that you completely eliminate SMS and voice just because of the security limitations with those MFA options. So it's very important that MFA at minimum is enforced across all your sign-ins against your organization. We'll look at shortly about conditional access policy and how to apply that and where it'll play a role. Now, Microsoft Entra ID is also changing the game with passwordless, right? A lot of organizations have kind of gone away from, the traditional username password, enforcing MFA. Now, hackers don't break in, they log in, right? What that means is they're going to, if there's a password, they're going to try to log in, right? They're going to try to use the username, and they're going to log in username and password. That's the way they know how to log in and get access to a user's account. Now, if you eliminate the password and you no longer have a password, well, they have nothing to log into anymore, because, they really can't, a lot of these MFA factors, you can't really break into an MFA. So really, there's a lot of momentum in passwordless. Microsoft provides different options, including the Microsoft Authenticator we looked at earlier, using FIDO2 keys, using Windows Hello for Business. I myself, daily when I log in, I can't remember the last time I used my password to log in. I come into my machine using Windows Hello for Business, using biometrics. I show my face or use a PIN, and I log onto my machine securely, and I'm able to single sign on across all my applications. So there's a lot of momentum in kind of going with that passwordless model. Now, I talked about conditional access. So conditional access really is a powerful capability of Entra ID. I've helped a lot of organizations really create a robust set of conditional access policies to really control each and every sign-in. So it puts that control into the organization's hands. You're able to use a lot of different signals. So there's a lot of signals on each sign-in. So look at a sign-in, it looks at the user that's signing in. It looks at what application are you signing into. It looks at what device you're connecting from. It looks at your risk in real time, right? So it's evaluating that sign-in and saying, okay, are you logging in from the same IP you normally log in with? Are you logging in from the same device you're normally logging with? If it sees any differences, if it sees something is different, then it's able to apply that machine learning logic I talked about to really apply policy accordingly. Now, once you look at the signals, then it says, okay, what are the controls? What am I going to apply? So you can say, okay, allow access, right? You can say, oh, require MFA. You can limit that access, right? Enforce, as an example, MFA at that given time when there is a risk involved, as an example. It can force if there's a user risk, like a secure password reset. And if you have on-prem, it can write that password back to on-prem. Or you can put policies in what's called report-only mode, so you can monitor that policy, because many times you're not aware, okay, if I implement the policy in my environment, what's going to happen? I'm not really entirely sure. So you put it in report-only mode to kind of give you that information so you can monitor that access and configure and tweak your policies accordingly. So if you haven't looked at conditional access policy, or if you've used it minimally, I highly, highly recommend, because conditional access policies are the backbone to controlling that sign-in into your environment, and really brings a lot of power in what EntreID is able to do. So EntreID identity protection. So I love this feature. I mean, this is amazing and what it can do, and how Microsoft really takes that game to the next level, right? Identity protection really looks at each sign-in, as we were mentioning earlier, and evaluates that risk level. And that's something that's really, really important. So this diagram here kind of shows you how Microsoft is looking at. So look at those two red dots, right? Let's say that you were logging in from, say, the United States. You logged into your environment. You logged in normally. Then let's say within 10 minutes, there was a login attempt completely from a different country. There was a login attempt on your account from Europe, right? So Microsoft looks at those two logins and say, okay, what's going on with this? Why is this user logging in from the US and then within 10 minutes logging in from a different country? Something is not right here, right? So it looks at that and says, okay, there's either a sign-in risk or maybe the user is being compromised, right? So this feature is really, really highly important for any customer who at least has EntreID Plan 2. I highly recommend that this is enforced, because this is really going to reduce a lot of the types of risks that can occur again in your environment. And it's able to adaptively say, okay, if there is a risk detected, what I'm going to do is I'm going to enforce MFA on that sign-on. Even though that you just did MFA on your initial sign-on, I'm going to enforce MFA to make sure if the bad actor is trying to log in and has your username and password, they can't log in because they can't enforce MFA. Or it's going to say, okay, if it detects that, depending on the risk level, that there is a user risk involved, then it's going to force a secure password reset against that user. So it's really powerful and can really do a lot. So for any organization who has the capability to deploy EntreID protection, I highly recommend it. And it brings a lot of that power and that machine learning and evaluating all of those sign-in and all of those risks. So I really, really recommend that you get this implemented again into your environment. So, and I mentioned also earlier, having that seamless user experience, right? And the SSO portal, one of the, best kept secrets is the SSO portal that Microsoft provides for your end users. Now, I've seen a lot of organizations not necessarily heavily use this or even be aware that the SSO portal actually even exists, right? So this provides your end users a portal to unify and show you a list of all the apps that you're allowed to connect to, right? Gives that seamless user experience. You see here all the different apps you can categorize and have different groups for each of your apps. So I highly recommend that this is, implemented and users use it in your environment, especially when you have a lot of different SaaS applications that users connect to. It's hard to manage all of the apps and all that you have. So this kind of gives you that unified view and that SSO portal to log into. Now, EntreID application protection. So I'm sure many of us and many organizations have a lot of legacy and on-premise applications, right? And they have a dependency for users to use VPN, right? there's a heavy usage and saying, okay, we need to make sure you get on VPN, you VPN, and then you get access to this on-premise application. Well, with Entra ID application proxy, you're able to publish that on-premise application through an Entra ID application proxy and really put the power of Entra ID in front of that application. Why that's important? Then you can apply. Earlier we talked about conditional access. Now you can apply all those modern conditional access policy, those risks that we talked about with Entra ID protection. You can apply all of that logic that you just built on your on-premise legacy applications. And now users don't have to VPN into the environment. They don't have to worry about, okay, now I need to connect. And your VPN isn't going to be your source of, say, firewall and protection against that app, and except now you're applying the power of Entra ID to your on-premise legacy application. So that's where the power of Entra ID and the Entra application proxy kind of comes into play. So really for any organizations who have those on-premise and those line of business applications that you want to expose and bring the power of Entra ID and the different capabilities that are available. Privileged identity management, another amazing feature of Entra ID and the identity governance. So the reason we like to talk about PIM is I can't stress the importance of making sure that admin roles are properly rolled out to your end users. Now, a lot of times we found that users and admins don't necessarily always need access at all times. A lot of times you have a lot of colleagues that are performing tasks, say on a one-time basis, right? They're performing it, one time, and then they don't need to do it again. So rather than provide them permanent access, you can use privileged identity management to enforce on-demand, just-in-time access, where a user is able to elevate their account when they need to perform a specific admin role. Once they're completed with that task, the role is immediately removed from their account, depending on, of course, how it's configured and how the role is configured. So it's really it has a lot of power in what it could do, and it really allows you to not think of it as kind of a zero trust model, right? Assume breach and verify each and every sign in and provide the least privilege possible, right? So you want to really always think in those terms. So that's where privileged identity management comes into play. Making sure, if you haven't looked at it, please make sure you look at all your admin roles. Make sure you know who has admin access, who has it permanently granted. Yes, there will be some cases, of course, some users will need permanent access, but in a majority of cases, you can provide on-demand access, right? When needed, they get the admin role and then they're able to, perform that task, and then the privileges expire and they're removed from the account, and brings that security back into your control. So really look at this if you haven't already, because your admin roles are really sacred. So I want to make sure I have the importance of making sure that's looked at in every environment, right? Entra ID integration scenario. So there's the different types of identities and different scenarios. We have your, cloud identities for organizations who are fully cloud, don't have any on-premise presence. You have the more common scenario, synchronized identity, when you have your Active Directory environment and you have Entra ID Connect to sync your identities from on-prem to Entra ID. So that's the more common scenario for a lot of organizations who have the on-premise identity, and then through Entra ID Connect, you sync your password hash from on-prem, set that as your password hash in Entra ID, and have that synchronized identity with on-prem being the source of authority. And then you have the organizations who have the federated identity. If you're using, say, a different identity provider and you federate with them. So now there's different scenarios, where that kind of comes into play. A lot of organizations have moved kind of away from that federated identity model, right? And move into, using Entra ID as your, I talked about how Entra ID is your full identity and access management system. And to, many people might not be aware of all these capabilities, of course, with Entra ID. So as you look at it, moving to that synchronized identity, and then at some point, once you no longer have an on-premise dependency at all, you can move to a, native cloud-only identity with Entra ID. But that's, that takes some time naturally to get to. I've seen organizations who've fully gone to that level because they say, I don't want to have an Active Directory anymore to manage, but, that takes some time, especially if you have a lot of legacy applications, a lot of dependencies. So it's really important to kind of look at all the different types of integration scenarios and understand really where Entra ID really fits in for your organization. So that kind of covers Entra ID. Now I want to kind of get into and talk about Microsoft Intune. So we touched on Microsoft Intune and what it could provide. So Microsoft Intune is a cloud-based endpoint management system. So really brings you and gives you the control to manage your device real estate, right? Managing your endpoints and devices are absolutely critical. So you really want to understand and control what devices connect to your organization. You know, I can't stress the importance of this enough. I've seen a lot of, many organizations who have a lot of different types of devices. They could be personal, they could be corporate, right? A lot of different types of devices that are actually connecting. Now, people might not be aware of what Microsoft Intune can provide. So it really brings that management into the environment and allows you to enforce the different policies on your devices, really push out those different applications to your machines, right? And we'll look at shortly about applying compliance policies against your devices to really make sure that only compliant devices connect to your environment, right? So limit the use of work apps, including Copilot, on personal devices, right? Controlling what types of devices can, a lot of the questions we get is, I want to make sure I know what devices are connecting. I don't want to allow anybody to fire up their own personal laptop, which I can't manage, which I can't enforce policies against and connect to my environment, right? So really bringing that management and that power is where Microsoft Intune comes in. And of course, containing and controlling your company data, right? We talked about, as you know, with Copilot for Microsoft 365, right? There's a lot of data that it's looking at. There's a lot of data that it's processing, right? So you want to really make sure that your data is controlled, right? That's where having control of your endpoints, whether that be Windows, Mac OS, right? iOS or Android devices, having that control is really important so you can manage not only the device, but also managing the data on that device. And we'll talk about app protection policies in more detail and having capabilities to wipe corporate data off of your machine. So now, there are different scenarios on how to integrate your devices into Entra ID. So we'll kind of touch on the few different scenarios. I'll start with the Microsoft Entra registered devices. These are your personal. Typically, these are user-owned devices that when a user actually, if you don't have Intune deployed and users are not actually joining their devices through corporate means, these are registered devices. You probably, if you look at your organization now and you go to your devices, even though you're not using Microsoft Intune, you might see a ton of devices that are showing Microsoft Entra registered. These are typically your personal devices. These are not generally treated as corporate devices. And you want to look at the two scenarios on the left side, including Microsoft Entra Hybrid Join. These are your devices that are domain joined and Entra ID joined kind of at the same time. So for organizations who want to kind of slowly move into that model, hybrid Entra ID join exists to allow you to still keep that device on Active Directory and also keep it in Entra ID. Now, the more modern way, and I've helped organizations kind of go fully Entra join, right? Even with on-premise legacy support, many organizations might have the misconception that, oh, I have on-premise legacy, I have to remain in a hybrid mode. Generally, that's not the case, right? There are cases where hybrid might be the requirement, but Entra ID native join is really where a lot of organizations have moved into and keeping those devices essentially cloud-only devices, Entra ID join, corporate-owned, and you were able to still access all your on-premise legacy applications through Entra join devices. So really kind of the different types of integration scenarios. So I want to make sure I kind of cover that so you're aware. Now, I talked about compliance. I talked earlier about enforcing compliance, right? So Microsoft Intune compliance policies really allows you to set up and configure policies to control what devices connect to your organization, right? You want to make sure not only that you allow devices, but you want to control a specific level of compliance. So things like making sure and enforcing, as an example, that the device has device encryption through BitLocker, to make sure that firewall is enabled, to make sure things like antivirus is enabled, right? So there's also features like tamper protection to make sure that if the user kind of goes around the system and says, I'm just going to turn off the firewall, right? I'm going to go ahead and turn off antivirus, or I'm going to go ahead and do something on my device, or I refuse to update and update to the latest version. I'm going to stay on the legacy one because I don't want to have this one, the newer version, right? So that's where compliance policies come in. You can enforce a baseline set of policies and only allow devices that meet those requirements, that are considered those compliant devices, to connect to your environment. And if you see devices are no longer compliant, then you can notify your users, hey, we have a several set of non-compliant devices. You want to make sure to get devices into a compliant state before you connect. Now, compliance policies can be applied to iOS, can be applied to Android devices, and of course, Windows devices, Mac OS, and Linux devices. So it's really important to make sure not only you control which devices connect, but have at least a control of the compliance setting on those devices. Now, how that plays a role with conditional access. So earlier I talked a lot about conditional access policies and how important that is. Well, you take that to the next level. As you can see here, you can grant access to a device based on the device being marked by the system as compliant, right? So you might have a separate set of applications, right? So every organization has your baseline set of applications. You have your Microsoft 365 apps, right, that users connect to, which is Exchange Online. You have your OneDrive, your SharePoint Online, Teams, and your different Microsoft 365 app. Now, you might have other more sensitive applications that you want users, obviously, that connect to. So you can enforce device compliance either across all sign-ins, or you can look at specific applications. Really, the control, again, is in your hand. What I want to articulate here is how you can take that device compliance status and apply it towards conditional access policies, right? How you can create a policy that says, okay, based on this device being marked compliant, I'll allow access. If your device falls out of compliance, then I'm going to go ahead and block access. Now, one thing I'll want to caution here is before you do and before you enforce any conditional access policy, make sure that you first incorporate and configure the compliance policies, and then monitor to make sure that your devices are actually showing up as compliance before you go in and enable this. Because what might happen is sometimes you might create a compliance policy and something might be misconfigured. And I've seen this happen in an organization where all of a sudden these devices are not showing as compliant, although they are compliant technically, right? So you want to make sure before you enforce any sort of conditional access policy that you monitor these devices, make sure that they're showing up correctly before you enforce any of these conditions, right? Because it's very important, and it's really easy with conditional access policies to potentially lock out your users, lock out your devices. So of course you want to avoid that. As important and as robust as they are, they're also really sensitive in the sense that you can really break an organization if there's a misconfiguration there. So please make sure, proceed with caution. And I would also recommend that you enforce policies in report-only mode, including when you're looking at device compliance, just to make sure you're not inadvertently locking out your users or locking out your devices. Now, endpoint security policies. So these are amazing features that you can incorporate on your devices. So rather than push a set of different policies, so through Intune, you can push what's called configuration profiles. This allows you to configure a lot of parts of the actual device. Things like, websites, things that, your favorite website, restricting cookies as an example, a lot of different things, enforcing a background, right? You can do a lot of that. Same thing you could do from a security angle. Now, instead of doing that and having little different settings for each of these configurations, you can enforce endpoint security policies, which kind of brings you a device level security settings package. And this policy only contains security settings. So things for disk encryption, BitLocker encryption. So I've helped many organizations move away from the on-premise legacy ways of forcing device encryption and having BitLocker policies enforced on devices to make sure that each and every device is encrypted using BitLocker. So you have different policies strictly tied for device encryption. You have policies that are focused only on firewall and different firewall settings. You have policies that are only focused on antivirus settings, malware settings, things like that. So that's where endpoint security policies come in. They're a focused set of policies that only contain settings for endpoint security only. Doesn't really have settings for other components, which you roll out separately through Microsoft Intune. And these can be applied to both Windows and Mac OS devices. So really kind of gives you, as an administrator of the org, to be able to really have that finite set of endpoint security policies roll out to your machines. Now, Defender, and we'll talk about coming up in the next slide, we'll talk about Defender for Endpoint and what it can do. Now, with Microsoft and Microsoft Defender for Endpoint, you can really roll out and deliver endpoint security across all different platforms. Of course, we can deliver it across Windows, Mac OS, and Linux. You can also roll it out against mobile device OSs, so Android and iOS. You can roll it out to your virtual desktops, right? Windows 365, Azure Virtual Desktop. If you're using AVD, just because the devices are virtualized doesn't necessarily mean they don't have risk and that you can enforce. You can enforce the same policies. And we here at Revolved, we have, we leverage Windows 365 machines. We have, Windows endpoints. We have Mac endpoints. We have also mobile endpoints, right? So we enforce Defender for Endpoint across all the different types of platforms. So you can't just look only at Windows devices, because many organizations have, robust set of endpoints that are connecting. Also network devices, right? Your Cisco, Juniper, different providing endpoint security and Defender for Endpoint against your network devices. Now, of course, different OSs have different limitations as to what type of control you can have on that device level and different types of reporting that it does. So not every OS and not every platform will be exactly the same as the other one, but something that, just kind of take into consideration, of course, but you can provide endpoint security across all the different OSs and platforms. So Defender for Endpoint. Defender for Endpoint is an amazing feature, and it's an amazing part of the Microsoft set of tools to really provide that endpoint detection and response on that endpoint, right? So with Microsoft Intune, obviously you configure, and I talked about configuring all the different policies and the different configuration settings. Defender for Endpoint really brings that containerizing that device, right? So all the threat and vulnerability management, right? The next generation protection, endpoint detection and response. That's really, really important. So with Defender for Endpoint, you see signals on the device level. I would love to kind of show you some of that, but Defender for Endpoint really kind of breaks down activity on to the machine level, right? So it looks at what's happening on the machine in real time, right? If something is blocked, like if somebody's trying to access something on the machine, they're connecting to a blocked site, and it's able to kind of paint that picture and really look at all the signals coming from the device, and then based on that, if it detects something bad is happening, it's able to use automatic attack disruption to stop that attack in its tracks on the device level. So Defender for Endpoint is really powerful. Defender XDR, that endpoint detection and response. So if you are using a different, and many organizations are using a different endpoint detection and response, and maybe you haven't thought of Defender for Endpoint and using that as your solution, really has a lot of power. We personally use that and have all of our devices onboarded to Defender for Endpoint. And then in addition, it provides things like web content filtering that you can apply on your devices to basically, and I'll talk about shortly, how to use Defender for cloud apps to sanction an unsanctioned app. So immediately it's able to revoke access to specific sites using the web content filtering. So Defender for Endpoint really brings that next level protection on that endpoint level, rather than, with Microsoft Intune, you have your policies, your configurations, your settings. Defender for Endpoint really kind of brings that to the next level. So, and I talked about attack surface reduction and eliminating risks, right? Hardening the security on the device level. So really attack surface reduction really gives you that control on the device, have different policies to harden things on the on the device. So things like stopping Office macros running on the machine, right? Attack surface reduction rules, and it's part of the endpoint security package, really brings that control on that endpoint level to kind of harden those machines, set up those policies, right? To control things like removable media, as an example, if you want to restrict it, restricting USB devices, right? Attacking the, like, at that surface, right? So to really control things that are connecting onto the device. So it really gives you, as an organization, allows you to create those policies and controls. So now let's, we also mentioned earlier about Defender for Cloud Apps and securing your apps. So I wanted to kind of also talk about the third pillar, which is, securing your apps through Microsoft 365. So through Microsoft Intune, so we talked about app protection policies. So with app protection policies, what you're able to do is you're able to control the corporate data on those devices, right? So you might not necessarily, in some cases, and many organizations might have a restriction, especially on mobile, which is where I've seen most common, is controlling the mobile devices. Many organizations say, I don't want to necessarily control the mobile device and have management of a user's personal device, but at least I want to control my corporate data on the machine. That's where Intune app protection policies come into play. This allows you on both managed and unmanaged machines to be able to containerize and control your corporate data on that device. So once you have that control, you're able to, if there is a breach or if the user leaves the organization, or if there's an issue, then you're able to wipe the company data off that machine without necessarily wiping the device. And you as an organization see very, very limited data on that device, things like just the OS level and just the name of the device, and really nothing else. You can't see any personal data on that device. You can only see specific corporate managed data on that machine. So that's where app protection policies through Microsoft Intune kind of come into play. But it really allows you to control the corporate data on that app level without necessarily controlling the actual device. Now, a lot of you organizations will use it in tandem. If you control the device, you also want to control the data. So you can absolutely use both MDM from device management and also from app protection policies to control the device. So here's some of the actions it provides. So it allows you to restrict, say, copy and paste. So if you take data from a corporate managed app and you try to copy it to your, say, Notes app, as you see in the example, this is a really common practice, right? So, people will say try to screenshot something, or will take and copy and paste their Outlook and say, I'm going to copy it into my personal notes. And they're able to copy it. Well, once they try to paste it, instead of seeing the data, they see your organization data cannot be posted. Really powerful. And then in some cases, it actually blocks them from doing anything, and they get a warning that, hey, you can't do this because your app protection policy restricted this behavior. So it really kind of brings that control into what's a managed app and what's an unmanaged app, right? So, you can apply that protection to both managed, and I talked about managed devices and unmanaged. So in cases where you don't want to control the personal devices, that would fall in the unmanaged case. And in cases where you actually manage the device through either Intune or through a third-party MDM, if you have that in the environment as you're moving into Microsoft Intune, you can also apply a protection for your managed devices as well. So think of them as two separate components. MDM controls the device level, but doesn't look at the data, and the Intune MAM service or app protection policies manage the actual corporate data on that managed app. And also Defender for Cloud Apps. Defender for Cloud Apps really brings in the power and visibility into your organization to really discover all of your SaaS applications. So through Defender for Cloud Apps, you're really able to identify and understand what type of applications our users are connecting to, right? You can ask a lot of organizations, hey, are you aware of what types of apps your end users are using? Do you know what people are, your users are trying to connect to? Are they trying to use any public apps? Even though you might have specific policies that might say you're not allowed to connect to, say, Dropbox or Box, only use OneDrive as an example, or you shouldn't connect to these cloud apps, right? But once it's able to connect, users will connect to it, right? So with Defender for Cloud Apps, it brings that visibility and control into the admin to really see what types of apps our users are connecting to. And based off of that, and I mentioned earlier about web content filtering with Defender for Endpoint, you're able to say, okay, I'll go ahead and sanction this app, meaning that I do allow this app to be used. Or in reverse, I'm going to unsanction this app. Once you unsanction an app, it basically puts a block on that specific URL. So the next time the end user tries to connect, instead of connecting to that app, they get a message saying that you're not allowed to connect, or just depending on the browser and what level of protection or browser you're using. Windows and Edge will use, say, smart screen technology to give a warning, and things like Google Chrome and Firefox will just restrict that access, will block the user and say you cannot connect or unsupported protocol, right? So that's where Defender for Cloud Apps really comes in, brings that control to the administrator to see all of the different apps, and you're able to detect suspicious activity. If you see a specific end user using some sort of cloud app that you weren't expecting, you have that visibility now. Once the devices, again, get onboarded to Defender for Endpoint and you really enable Defender for Cloud Apps, I love it. It's an amazing, amazing set of tools that really no other service provider in the world can really provide. And it really brings that, management, so you can see also other AI apps, public AI apps that your users might be connecting to, right? We're talking about obviously Copilot for Microsoft 365. If you're making that your standard for your organization, you also want to know what other cloud apps or public AI apps your users might be connecting to. That's where Defender for Cloud Apps will really bring that visibility and that reporting to you as an organization. So, and once you use that, you can use that in tandem to basically have app control. So you define what type of policy based on that cloud app. So you're able to kind of configure app controls on those specific apps. So depending on the app, there's different controls that you can have. So we talked a lot about using conditional access policies for the apps that users are connecting to, but you might want to use controls within the app. So to prevent users, say, from uploading documents to, say, OneDrive as an example, to prevent uploading, not to OneDrive, I'm sorry, to connect to any public, cloud sharing apps, things like that. So to have control within the app, that's where you have conditional access app control. Once you see the visibility into those cloud apps, you're able to configure policies against those specific apps as well, and have different types of conditional access policy against that app. So really brings a lot more power into what conditional access policy can do. So I know I mentioned quite a lot of things, so I really appreciate everybody. I thank you for your time, for being here. I hope it was a pleasure for everybody and you learned a lot of important things today. I hope you're able to join us for our next session where we deep dive into the last pillar, which is data. As Ramon mentioned, data itself is really robust. There's a lot in the data landscape, so we have a dedicated session for that. So we hope you're able to join us for that. I really appreciate everybody's time today and hope you have a great rest of your day. And Shane, I'll pass it to you.
Yeah, thanks, Yasai. Great stuff. Thanks again for everybody for joining. Just a reminder, the next sessions will be on September 4th and September 12th at the same time we kicked off today. Please don't forget, Revanti is always here for you when you or your organization is looking for a deeper dive or more specific use cases of Microsoft's capabilities. Always here to help. So tap in, contact us, info@revanti.com, or head on over to our website, revanti.com, and we'll be happy to take care of you. Thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of your day. We'll see you all next time.